On this special episode of Supercars Talk, I take a look at my first ever model car, Peter Brock's 1989 Bathurst Sierra. I'll start this one off a little bit of history about my following of the Supercars Australian Touring Car Championship over the years. Many moons ago now, I remember I met Peter Brock at the local Holden dealer with his VL Commodore in there. I was a bit too young at that age to really realise kind of what was going on, I suppose. But when I did kind of comprehend watching the car racing, I do remember sitting in that Mobil car, and so Peter Brock became my man. It also helped, I suppose, my old man who got me into the sport. He was a Dick Johnson fan, so it was a bit of, red against white, I suppose, at the time. So everybody just assumes I'm a Holden kind of fan, but when I actually got into the sport was at this time when Peter Brock was driving a Sierra, of all things. So if you don't know the story, Brock was a Holden man for many years, had a falling out with them. Possibly get into that when I review the VL Commodore model. But he spent a year in BMWs and then got himself in the Sierra, which was the weapon of choice around that time. Dick Johnson had kind of dominated the 88 season in that car, and Brock had definitely struggled all year in the BMW. So he bought himself, I think at the time they originally bought two Andy Rouse Sierras. Andy Rouse was a big Ford guy over in the UK. I think they bought two and brought them over and started running with them. Funnily enough, I think this actual car at Bathurst, I think they debuted at Sandown, which was actually, I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on it, because there's probably someone out there who knows a bit more than me, but I'm pretty sure that this car was, or the Bathurst car, was an Australian-built Brock car. I don't think it was an imported Rouse car. So as you can see, Andy Rouse raced with him at Bathurst. This is one of the original Auto Art cars. I think they're brought in by Bianti as Bianti/Auto Art cars. Considering the age of these ones, they are brilliant. As this wasn't my first model car. I did have some of the little 1/43rd cars, but I count this as kind of my true first one, being the 1/18th. And they've definitely stood the test of time, these 1/18th Sierras, off the original Auto Art molds as well. I do plan on doing a video to show you, because there has been quite a few different Sierras made by different companies over the years. So this is one of the Auto Art ones. Go through a little bit of history of, because this is the 1989 car, a little bit of history in the season, because considering Brock only just got his hands on a Sierra this year, and considering some of the other guys had a few years experience in them, he did very well. Granted though, it would have been a well sorted car that he'd got from Andy Rouse at the time. He ended up in round 2, he was on pole and he finished second. He ended up winning the final round of the series at Oran Park. He was third in the points, and he also, as well as finishing second at Symmons Plains, he finished second at Sandown and Winton. So overall, the championship was pretty good. There was a couple of retirements in there. I didn't actually go into investigating what the retirements were for. Typically, with these cars at the time, probably a head gasket, which I think it was, they had the Pepsi 300 at Oran Park, and believe it or not, he was driving with what must have been a very young Mark Larkham at the time. So being younger and that, I didn't follow the junior series and that at that time. So the first I heard of Mark Larkham would have been 94 when they started building that first Mitre 10 Falcon for 95. I'm pretty sure it was 94 that they started doing that. So I was quite surprised. It's interesting pulling up these old results books and things like that, and finding that Mark Larkham actually drove with Brock there. So anyway, they started on pole at this Pepsi 300 at Oran Park, and they retired with a blown head gasket. And then the Sandown 500, he lined up with Paul Radisich, another, long time name. And interestingly, like these days, the guys sign one co-driver to do the Enduro Cup. And interestingly, Brock had 3 in this year. So he had Larkham, then Paul Radisich, and then Andy Rouse at Bathurst. They actually failed with suspension, and that was when they debuted what was this car. Which, as I said, I think it was the first one that Brock built in Australia. And then Brock, because in those days you could still cross-enter cars, so Brock jumped in what was the number 105, that had Brad Jones and Mark Larkham in the car, and they ended up finished 7th, 6 laps down in that car. He did start second on the grid as well at Sandown, so definitely qualifying was definitely not a problem for that year, and that came true as well at Bathurst, where he stuck the thing on pole. They had a bit of an issue with the stewards after the qualifying lap. He did get to keep his pole and did get to start from pole. I suppose a little bit like the whole Scott McLaughlin thing from last year. So I did not know about this until researching about this car. They got a $5,000 fine because they had the fire extinguisher pointing at the intercooler at the front of the car. Apparently, they couldn't prove that they were using it to cool the intercooler down on the qualifying lap, but it's not something you're allowed to do. The fire extinguisher is there to put out fires, not to cool down your intercooler. And for those who don't know, these are turbocharged car. You probably heard about that. And they have an intercooler on the front, which cools the air that goes into the turbocharger, and you make bulk amounts of power if you can cool that air down further, so the air is more dense. Obviously you have to put in the corresponding fuel for all of that, but yeah, I don't know the full technicalities of the engine, but I know if you can get the intake temps in cooler through the intercooler into the turbo, you make big bangs and you make lots of power, so that's why that was there. Interestingly, $5,000 fine for it. Did get to keep his pole in that though, because as far as I can tell, because they couldn't prove that he'd actually used it, during it was just set up to be used. Anyway, the day didn't go to plan. They had a rear wheel loose on lap 3. And then by the time lap 81 came around, they couldn't get the wheel that was loose at the start of the race. Then the wheel nut had jammed itself on, and they probably uggered it on a bit too hard, and they ended up cutting it off, but they did too much damage to the hub, so they couldn't then get another wheel on it. So that was day done, over and out. They did then, as what happened back in those days, they went over to New Zealand for a couple of races at the end of the year. Nissan Mobil NZ Series, I think they called it. They had a race at Wellington and a race at Pukekohe. At the Wellington, he paired up with Paul Radisich over there. They had the Wellington 500, started on pole once again. As I said, his qualifying was definitely not a problem in the Sierra this year. They ended up finishing 4th. And then in the Pukekohe 500, which weirdly enough was a 2 kind of heat race, they started on pole once again, finished 2nd overall. Johnson at Bow won. Radicic came into the pits earlier than expected, and apparently Brock was stood there chatting to some fans and wasn't ready to jump in the car, so they lost a fair bit of time in the pits. And yeah, Johnson and Bow beat them with some better pit stops, but they did get to win that. If there was an award for the series win back then, they would have won it because of finishing fourth and second gave them, the overall best results for that series. So that's my review, I suppose, more of the 1989 Brock Sierra than the actual model. As it is a beautiful car. It was my first 1/18th model. It's still, I look at it today, it still stands the test of time. The dimensions and everything were really good. All the decals and everything on this one look period correct to the day. Let's not get into the interiors on these. Obviously, there's a lot of Sierras running around, and I think Auto Art did a bit of a generic right and left-hand drive interior on them. But the car definitely looks the part, and it's, considering it's my oldest one, it's still one of my favourites in the collection, probably because of what it signifies. It was the first guy that I followed, and this was the car that he was driving at the time. So that's my review of Brock's 1989 Sierra. Leave some comments down below. Is there any specific cars you want me to review, or you're happy for me to just go along and pick ones at random? Do you like the Sierras? Do you like the quality of these? As I said, I'm surprised, considering the age of these, how well they actually stand up next to some of the newer cars. And also these ones, I can't quite get my finger in there, but see with the boot where you can get into it, all opening parts on them and things like that, which you can't get these days. Granted though, at the time, I think this was about $180 at the time, which is pretty similar to what we're paying these days, although some of them have now kind of crept up around that $240, $250 mark. But for a long time, the models did stay around that $180, $190 mark. So until next time, I'll see you later.